Hello, welcome back. This is my review and analysis of Loki episode 2, season 2. So I love this episode even more than the first one. Let me tell you, whoever had this idea of calling the episode Breaking Brad is truly a genius. Now for this episode I have a lot to say, so I'm not going to do a run through like last time. I'm going to break it down into various themes. Starting with, Loki is back in badass mode. So last season there were lots and lots of complaints about Loki being weak or pathetic or stupid in the series, and I did not really agree with these criticisms to begin with. But most of all, I kept arguing that this was just a phase. It was the first part of his character arc. He needed this reconfiguration of everything he thought he knew about himself and about the world, and this phase of confusion. And then he would be able to pick himself up, and then he would grow in confidence and power. And this is exactly what's happening. First, there's a lot of magic. He's using it efficiently with authority. We get green energy blasts, we get telekinesis, we get illusions, duplication casting, I think that was, and shadows. But I'm not absolutely sure about shadows being a different power, or if it's just basically telekinesis but with an added sense of drama.
A little over the top, don't you think, all the shadow play? I thought it was spot on.
Also, he walks with purpose. He has found his new glorious purpose, whether it's finding Sylvie or saving the universe, or maybe both at the same time. Remember last season he was a bit chaotic in his movements, and people complained about that as well, that it was not the very poised Loki we used to know. And the same can be said about the way he runs. There was this great scene when he was running after Brad, and we all know Tom Hiddleston loves to run, but remember in the Lamentis episode, I had remarked upon this at the time or in one of my analysis videos since then, that the way he was running was very chaotic, especially compared to Sylvie, who was running in a much more put together way, let's say. And that was meant to be symbolic of his confusion, I suppose, and his chaotic nature as well. But here you see he's not confused anymore, he knows where he's going, and it's reflected in his body language and the way he runs, for example. He also seems to have a bit more of a princely manner. Not that he ever lost it completely, but it's coming back a bit stronger now. You can see that in the way he dresses, for example, for the premiere. His shirt is very fancy compared to Mobius's much more sober shirt, and also even Brad's actually is more sober than Loki's, so you can see there's a sense of aristocratic importance here, and the way he talks as well. I noticed the way he called Obi Ouroboros at one point, and that seems a bit pompous.
Obi? Hello? Ouroboros?
So far I am not surprised by this evolution. I predicted it, I expected it, but I'm happy to see it anyway. Now, a pretty short point but an important one, I really loved Brad's chemistry with Loki. The two actors really play off each other very, very well. I didn't know Rafael Casal, but he's a brilliant actor. I really loved his scenes. I was kind of fascinated by all the scenes that Brad appeared in. I wrote on my notes for the episode banter plus plus plus, so I just loved the banter. I thought it worked so well. And I think Brad is a great new character, just like Obi, and he's a multi-dimensional character. He's not a stereotype, he's quite complex already, even though we've only seen a few scenes with him. But we can see that he can be a complete jerk, he can also be a formidable adversary, he's clever, he's ruthless, he's experienced, so he's someone to be reckoned with. But at the same time, there are moments when he seems like a petulant child and he freaks out and is pretty funny. So I really love that, the fact that they made him complex already. And I'm a bit surprised that he bailed on the mission, given how close he seemed to be with Docs in the previous episode, so I wonder if there isn't something there that is going to be revealed later. Apart from the fact that, of course, he was trying to hide that she was pruning all these branches. But anyway, another great addition to the cast. I'm absolutely delighted with all the new characters this season. Mobius and Loki still have this great dynamic, but now we also have a great dynamic with Obi and another great dynamic with Brad. Now it might seem a bit weird, but I'm going to devote a whole part of this analysis to Loki's actions in the Avengers. If you have spent time in the Loki fandom, you will probably be aware that there has long been a debate among fans over how much agency Loki really had during the Avengers. Now, I think this would probably deserve an entire video, but I'm just going to go over it quickly. So the main theories are: one, that Loki was mind-controlled by Thanos through the scepter. Two, that Loki was tortured by Thanos before the events of the Avengers, and that this forced him to eventually do Thanos' bidding. And three, that he acted out of fear of Thanos. So these can actually overlap, of course. But in any case, in these three theories, Loki did not do what he did in the Avengers because he wanted to. He did it because he was forced or he was afraid. So it was not his own will. Personally, I never really subscribed to these interpretations, although, of course, it must be said that some of these things are true to a certain degree. It is clear that Loki is afraid of Thanos. It is also clear that the other threatens Loki with torture if he fails. That is in the film. It's also very clear that Loki has misgivings about what he's doing. We see it in various scenes that he's got tears in his eyes while looking at the destruction. So he's not completely on board. Coulson actually makes this point by saying he lacks conviction. And finally, it is also true that the scepter is influencing Loki. It is fueling his anger, but not mind-controlling him, which is not the same thing at all. But we do know that the scepter influences people by intensifying their anger, and it has been confirmed by Marvel on their website in the official biography for Loki. So this much is true. But when it comes to this idea that Loki had absolutely no agency, that he was forced to do something or that he was coerced, I think this episode has just crushed these theories completely. Anyone who's interested in this debate must have picked up the importance of these lines that Loki pronounces in the cafeteria.
You remember that time? I was so angry with my father and my brother. I went down to Earth and I held the whole of New York City hostage with an alien army.
So here we have Loki himself telling us that his primary motivation was actually anger towards Thor and Odin. And I know that when analyzing fiction, you should never assume that just because a character says something, then this thing is true, because a character is not necessarily a narrative authority. But in this case, Loki is kind of an authority on his own thoughts and motives. I know also that Loki is known for lying to himself, but he seems to have reached a certain appeasement here regarding these issues. We saw that when Brad was trying to get under his skin by calling him a villain, talking about all the bad things he had done, and Loki resisted this. So it shows that he has matured, he has gained control over some of these reflexes that he used to have. So these issues now don't bother him as much as they used to, and he's able to be more lucid about these things and just acknowledge his own responsibility in them. So here we had Loki taking responsibility for his actions and settling a long-standing argument. And now I come to the highly anticipated reunion between Sylvie and Loki. And it didn't go very well, which apparently disappointed some fans, but honestly I really cannot see how it could have been otherwise. I saw many viewers point out that Loki had been stupid, that he didn't say or do the right thing, that he shouldn't have come to her in his TVA uniform, that he should have come alone instead of bringing Mobius and Brad, or that he should have talked about more personal things like how was she, what was her life like, or apologized rather than talk directly about the TVA and the fate of the universe. And also that he should have asked her to follow him into the TVA, because if you look closely you can see her longingly looking at him while he's not looking. But I don't really agree with all these takes. Yes, it is true that Loki is awkward when it comes to expressing his feelings, and so is Sylvie, by the way. But would any of this have worked any better? I think not. Because for me, the main problem is still there. It is still the same problem that they had at the end of season 1, and it is that they fundamentally disagree about what to do. Back then I argued that no one had betrayed the other in that season finale. It was just that they disagreed on something very important. But they were faced with a dilemma, and they did not agree on the correct solution. And they still don't. That is the main problem they have now. She was convinced that killing He Who Remains was the only possible solution, while he was convinced that it would be a huge mistake and the right solution was to agree to run the TVA differently. And think about it, he's working for the TVA anyway, or with the TVA at the very least. And he was going to tell her that at one point, so even if he had come to her talking about feelings, knowing Sylvie, she's not someone who trusts people, and she is suspicious of Loki, and she would have felt manipulated very clearly once he had revealed his purpose. So I don't think it would have worked any better, it might actually have been even worse. And the problem here is really about their respective postures. Sylvie's entire life rests on the premise that killing He Who Remains was the correct choice. Now she's happy, she's built a life for herself, and she has to continue believing that it was the right choice. She's happy this way, and she still holds on to this belief. She's not going to let go of that belief easily. We know that she's very single-minded and even stubborn, and she has to hold on to that belief, because if she doesn't, then she probably will just fall apart. And you can tell from her attitude that she's desperately holding on to this belief because, some people are arguing that she doesn't care at all about Loki because she was very cold to him. But really, if you watch carefully, you can see that the first few seconds when he enters the McDonald's, she looks very, very moved. She has tears in her eyes, just like him. And when she answers at first, when he says hi and she replies, she does have a little smile on her face. So she's not immediately cold, but then you can see that there's a reaction and she just completely decides to pull up the drawbridge, close herself off. And then she becomes cold and snarky, and you can tell that it's a strategy to keep him out. She doesn't want to let him in any way. In a way, she also has to stick to this belief that he betrayed her. So if she lets go of her anger at him, she also kind of lets go of her entire belief system. And I've just said that, in my opinion, she needs to cling to this belief system, so she cannot do that. And then on the other side of this problem, Loki is not comfortable expressing his feelings either. We know he's never been very good at this. But also, he's very confused at this point. She kissed him at the end of season 1, everyone remembers that, and he doesn't know how genuine this kiss was. We can assume it was at least partly genuine, that's my belief anyway, but he is confused and he doesn't know. Maybe she just did that to manipulate him. He has no idea. And we know that Loki is terrified of rejection because Loki's main trauma is his feeling, having felt unloved and unlovable all his life, that he was never good enough, that his father always preferred his brother. So rejection is something that he's very, very scared of. And so he's never going to be open about his feelings in a situation like this. And he also made it clear in the previous episode that there's still some embarrassment here. He feels a little silly, first because he doesn't know if his feelings are reciprocated or not, but also because in her eyes he's still a traitor, and he also feels guilty for being unable to convince her. So that's where they're at. She's clinging to a series of beliefs that she cannot let go of. He's afraid of expressing his feelings and being rejected. And ultimately, they still completely disagree on a very fundamental issue, which is basically the fate of the multiverse. So that will take time to resolve, and I'm not sure there's anything he could have said or done differently that would have made a difference in that regard. And finally, I think he did the right thing by not asking her to follow him into the TVA, because by doing this, he respected her expressed wishes. And I think that's important. I think it's a good thing that he did that. And he let her decide of her own accord whether she wanted to go through this portal or not. And she did, which actually mirrors what he did in the second episode of season 1, so I'm sure that's done on purpose too. Now I'm sure that Sylvie will be mulling over what she has heard, and it will probably lead to a change in her attitude, but that could not have happened so fast in just one episode. I don't think it could. And now I come to what is possibly my favorite thing about the episode, and this is what I've called Mobius's identity crisis. Once again, I think it's brilliant writing because they're not taking the most obvious path there for Mobius. The obvious path would be to assume that once they know the truth about the TVA, all the TVA workers would be desperate to get back to their lives on the sacred timeline and to know what their lives were. That's the case for B15. But surprise, Mobius is not so keen about finding out about his life before the TVA. And I love this because it creates a really interesting conflict for the character. There is even a reversal of roles, with Loki kind of acting as the therapist here, and Mobius being the one who's agitated and unsettled and allowing Brad to get under his skin. And well, there are several things we could say about Mobius's insistence that this is not his life.
Because it's not my life.
But it could have been.
It isn't. This is.
First, there is the fact that unlike B-15, he hasn't been enchanted by Sylvie, and so he hasn't been able to, have a sneak peek of what his life might have been. Second, there is the obvious possibility that he might be afraid to know, and that, as he says, what if he finds out that his life was better? That would be really hard to bear. But apart from all this, I think he still makes a very interesting point there, and it's a point that brings us back to one of the main themes of the series and the most interesting ones, which is identity, and especially its relationship to memory. Because in this context, what is Mobius's real life? That's really the question that's being asked here. What is his real life? Brad keeps saying the TVA is not real, but is that true? As far as Mobius is concerned, the only life he knows and remembers is his life at the TVA, and he says he likes working as an analyst for the TVA. He says this, and actually there's no reason not to believe him, because from what we have seen, he seems to be enjoying it. He's a great analyst, he enjoys the work, he's excited all the time, he has a great relationship with his co-workers, he likes the cafeteria and the weird food they serve there. He seems pretty happy to me. Why should we automatically assume that he was happier on the sacred timeline? Maybe he wasn't, or maybe his life was miserable. And this idea that your real life is the life that you remember and not some other life that you have no memory of, it really reminds me once again of Blade Runner. In Blade Runner there are some very human-like androids called replicants, and there is an experiment that's carried out which consists of implanting memories into their heads. So they believe that these memories are real, and the idea is it makes them almost undistinguishable from humans, and they themselves believe they're humans even. So Mobius's point has merit. The life that is real life for him, from his point of view, is the one that he's living right now. And it's actually a pretty human reaction when you think about it, because imagine if someone came to you and told you your life is fake, you've been lied to, and this is not your real life, and you have another life somewhere that you don't remember. How many people would actually be like, yeah, I'm just gonna give up on my life, and now I know it's all fake, now I don't care about anything, about the relationships I have, about the memories I have. That's not what most people would do, I think. So to go back to Mobius, I think in his case it's a really great conflict to give to this character. And it's going to be so interesting to watch him solve this conflict, because we can already detect some paradoxes and ambiguities in his attitude. We can note, for example, that Mobius is still very much a TVA man, and you see it especially in this scene.
Right now, it's like they're going over every detail of their relationship that has ever happened. Why?
It's a complicated relationship, okay? There's a lot to unpack when you're basically in a relationship with yourself.
Yeah.
And in this case, I am going to refer to this very important principle in analyzing fiction, that just because a character says something does not mean the work is saying that. And here that's really a case in point, I believe. I've already said before in other videos that I believe that one of the main messages of this work is that variants are not the same person, and that's why they're valuable as well. What makes a person important is also that they are unique by definition, and no two people can be the same, it's impossible. So even if you start off with almost the same DNA, you will not end up with two identical people if they have lived different lives. And just to make sure that everyone understands this, I am not arguing that Sylvie and Loki have the same DNA, because that's not the case. But even if they did, they still wouldn't be the same person. But that is TVA propaganda, and what Mobius is saying here is just what he's been told his entire life, as far as he's concerned. Mobius is still very much attached to the TVA, he says it himself, and he's not really clean of all the propaganda yet, and I think this line is to be understood in this context. And there are moments when he says things that are not completely consistent with his professed love for the TVA and this idea that he doesn't need to know what his life would be like on the sacred timeline. For example, when he's discussing Brad with Loki, Loki says,
He wants more time to be Brad Wolf.
Who wouldn't?
Right.
Who wouldn't? Well, based on what you just said, you wouldn't. So that's weird. It seems completely obvious to him that Brad wants his life on the sacred timeline, but he's not interested in doing the same thing. And most importantly, I think there's one main reason why Mobius will not be content with remaining ignorant of his life on the timeline, and that is the fact that Mobius has always been characterized by his curiosity. It was one of his main traits up to now, and yet on this one he's siding with Sylvie. Sylvie, who has never really been very curious, is not one of her main traits. Here both are taking the same stance, that they are happy with their lives as they are and they don't want to know anything that would compromise this. And Loki, on the other hand, is all about curiosity, and that's actually something I wanted to make a video about because it's a really interesting theme that runs through season 1 and season 2 now. And until then, Mobius and Loki were very similar in that way. They both shared this trait, which I think was one of the reasons why they made such a great team, because they are both very curious and they're intellectuals and they love to think and they want to know things. And so even if I'm ready to believe that Mobius is actually happy working at the TVA, I believe that at one point the desire to know will be stronger. I don't think he will be able to resist the temptation of knowing, and also there may not be a TVA to work in at some point, so maybe he will have to give up on it anyway. But I think he will want to know. And now I'd like to finish with a few quick remarks, and the first one is about humour. One thing that is consistently perfect about this show, I think, is the way it integrates humour. Marvel has often been criticized for using too much humour, trying to kind of shoehorn the obligatory joke, and kind of undermining the sense of importance and any sense of tension in their movies. But I think in this case, that's not what happens. There's humour, it works, but it does not undermine the sense that what's happening is serious. There are moments that are very tense, like for example the interrogation scenes with Brad. I was just hanging on to their every word. I was just fascinated by these scenes, these dialogues, and it looks like filmed theatre, but it's just riveting. I also just love the running gag of the TVA manual, the orange book that Obi wrote, and the fact that Casey, well, no one cares about that book, but Casey has memorized the whole thing, and that was so funny. And I like the fact that Casey is not just the butt of the joke. There's one scene in which he looks a bit silly with B-15, making fun of him because he thinks that the Renslayer mission is somehow a secret, which it's obviously not anymore. But just immediately after, he turns out to be the MVP because he knows the book by heart, and so I like that, because it would be a bit cringe if he was constantly the butt of the joke. I also really laughed at the troubleshooting scene because Loki and Mobius are equally bad at this stuff. Like, you can tell they're analysts, they're there for the intellectual work, but the manual work is not so much their forte, and Loki also has no patience with this kind of thing. It's not that he's not intelligent enough, but he just doesn't like, spending hours on a very tedious task. And I love the way they're using B-15 as a kind of audience proxy. She has the best facial expressions. And this actually leads me directly to my next remark, which is about how meta this show consistently is. And I'm loving this. For example, there are moments when they discuss scripts and actors, so the meta dimension is obvious here. The whole Loki is trying to be a hero when he was meant to be a villain. So that also echoes some complaints by some Marvel fans who are not happy with the way they're taking Loki. And also, of course, that great moment when basically Mobius and Brad were just almost taking popcorn to watch how the reunion between Loki and Sylvie unfolded. That was brilliant. I just love that they're continuing to do this, and it's a little bit on the nose, but it works so well with this show. I was a bit bothered at one point by one little thing, and it's not often that I criticize the writing on this show, so maybe I just did not understand something, because usually the writing is very tight. But I did not understand how Loki could have kept from the others the fact that he heard that recording with Ravonna and He Who Remains. So yeah, I know a lot of catastrophes have happened and they've got a lot on their plate, and he probably had lots of other things to think about, but it seems like something that you would report to other people, right? If you heard a conversation between the big bad and the other person you were after, who's gone rogue and has disappeared. It seems like a pretty big piece of information that you should probably share with your co-workers. And finally, last but not least, I want to say that I criticized Sylvie's wig last week, but this week I'm gonna say that this wig looks great. Actually, I'm pretty sure some people don't realize it's a wig. I know it's a wig because I was following Sophie on Instagram and I know she had short hair and there's no way that was her hair, but still, it looks very, very good. And that's it for today. I can't wait for episode 3, so I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. If you have any comments or remarks or you disagree with me, leave me a comment, or even subscribe to the channel if you're interested in more Loki videos, because I'm going to be making more, definitely. So I'll see you next week for episode 3. Bye bye!